Good afternoon. I'm Michelle Stockwell, Senior Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center, and welcome to our series on modernizing Congress. A modern Congress, a functional Congress. Now, those may seem like oxymorons, but last Congress, the House of Representatives did something that it hadn't done for more than a quarter century. It formed a select committee to examine ways to make Congress function better and update the institution for the 21st century. That committee, the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, ended up being one of the most successful of its kind, making nearly 100 recommendations for improving the legislative branch of our representative government. As impressive as the Modernization Committee's achievements were, equally impressive was how it went about its work. The committee, which was made up of equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats, unanimously approved each of its recommendations, which is quite a bipartisan achievement in today's environment. All told, the committee held 16 hearings, more than a dozen in-person and virtual member gatherings, to come to agreement on the problems that plague the legislative branch and build consensus on how to overcome them. More than 1/3 of its recommendations have already been fully implemented. The committee was such a success that it was extended for another 2 years into the current 117th Congress. Today, we're pleased to have with us the bipartisan leadership of the committee to talk about how to continue building a Congress that works for the American people. So with that, let me introduce our guests. Today, we have with us Representative Derek Kilmer, who was chair of the committee last Congress and returns in that role. Representative Kilmer is serving in his 4th term in Congress, representing Washington's 6th Congressional District. In addition to chairing the Select Committee, he serves on the House Appropriations Committee. His pre-congressional background makes him well suited to his current role, as he's had a long track record as a business management consultant, helping businesses, nonprofits, and government agencies run more efficiently. He also served several years in the Washington State and Senate, and throughout his tenure at the state and federal level, he has shown his commitment to bipartisanship, particularly through his advocacy for veterans in the military community. Representative William Timmons was a member of the committee last Congress, and this year has been elevated to the position of vice chair. Representative Timmons is in his 2nd term and represents South Carolina's 4th Congressional District. In addition to being vice chair of the Modernization Committee, he also serves on the House Financial Services Committee. Before joining Congress, he was a prosecutor and small business owner and served in the South Carolina State Senate. He also continues to serve the country as a JAG officer and 1st lieutenant in the South Carolina Air National Guard. So with that, let me thank you both for joining us today. Before we start, I want to make sure attendees are aware that they can submit questions using the live chat on YouTube or Facebook or on Twitter using #VPCLive. I'd like to begin with a question to you, but first let me level set things a little bit. For those who are joining us and are less familiar with the Modernization Committee, can you give us a brief overview of the kinds of issues you consider and some of the key 97 recommendations you made last Congress? Let's face it, fixing Congress is a pretty monumental task. So how did you go about breaking that down? And maybe we'll start with you, Chairman.
You bet. First of all, thanks to you and to the Bipartisan Policy Center for having us. William and I have taken to doing rock, paper, scissors to determine who goes first when we do these joint appearances. So unfortunately, I only play rock, so he's figured me out. You mentioned at the get-go, about every 2 or 3 decades or so, Congress realizes things aren't functioning the way they ought to, and they create a select committee to do something about it. The last one was in the early 90s. Before that, it was in the 70s. So this is the latest iteration of that. And our goal, our mission is to have Congress work better for the American people, make it more effective, make it more efficient. And so that was really the nature of the work that we did. And at the outset, we made a decision that we didn't want to just produce a report, that we wanted to make recommendations and make change so that the legislative branch could actually function better. And we sort of divided and conquered. The committee members decided to take a different and more active approach to passing recommendations. So we often would engage internal and external stakeholders and have them participate in the process. And the result, as you mentioned, was 97 recommendations, all just designed to make Congress work better for all Americans. And those recommendations were on a variety of themes. Part of it was focusing on boosting the technology capacity of Congress in terms of how Congress uses technology to solve problems, to engage constituents. we had a whole group of recommendations focused on communications with constituents. We had recommendations oriented towards greater bipartisan collaboration, something that the BPC is so terrifically invested in, and trying to foster more bipartisan collaboration and civility, ultimately trying to improve the way members of Congress legislate and work together. We had some recommendations focused on the schedule and calendar of Congress. Members of Congress often spend too much time traveling and not enough time actually being in Washington, D.C. to do the hard work of solving problems. An area we made a number of recommendations on, but we're continuing to pull at the thread, are issues related to the recruitment, retention, and diversity of staff, so that we have a staff that is reflective of our nation from a diversity standpoint, and that we can hang on to some of these terrifically talented people. We also had a series of recommendations focused on restoring the Article 1 authorities of Congress so that it could truly be a co-equal branch of government. And some of that looked at issues related to budgeting, to how Congress makes spending decisions. And then finally, some of this was unique to the pandemic, although it's an issue we're looking at pre-pandemic, was issues related to the continuity of Congress. And that's a thread we're going to continue to pull here in the 117th Congress. So all in all, a pretty broad purview, a whole bunch of issues that we looked at, but all in the service of just trying to have a Congress that works better for the American people.
That's a pretty impressive breadth of issues. Congressman Timmons, how's implementation going, and how have all those multitude of recommendations been received by your colleagues? We know that some of them require legislation to fully come into fruition, and some require just the buy-in of your colleagues and particularly leadership. And how's that implementation process going, and where do we need to see further development?
Sure. Well, let me first start. If you think about the original committee, only was supposed to last a year, and then they extended it for another year, and now they've given us 2 more. So I just think that alone shows that everyone's bought into this, because leadership didn't have to extend for another year last Congress, and they certainly didn't have to give us 2 more years this Congress. So I think we're moving in the right direction. Everyone really appreciates the work we're doing. This is not partisan stuff. Trying to make Congress more efficient, more effective, and more transparent for the American people, that's not partisan, and it really elicits strong responses from both sides of the aisle, because everyone can see that Congress is just dysfunctional, and we do need to make some structural and some procedural and some pretty major changes to try to facilitate the conversations that are going to be able to solve these big problems. I mean, immigration, healthcare, debt, spending, all of these major challenges, we're not going to get a party line vote ever to fix these challenges. So we got to work together. We got to find a way to get good policy-based solutions to fix these big problems. So far, we've gotten about 1/3 of the recommendations implemented. One of the big things, that I was the freshman last Congress, and we were very concerned about orientation. I often joke, I thought they were kidding when they told me to get on the Republican bus. And I was like, but is this real life? I mean, are you really going to tell us that Republicans and Democrats have to be separated during orientation? I mean, that's just not, that's starting off on the wrong foot. So we've already implemented a number of recommendations regarding orientation. The calendar and the schedule, we made a number of recommendations, and I think it's really challenging to implement those during the pandemic. So I think that it's something that we're definitely going to be spending a lot of time on this Congress. We had a number of other recommendations. I mean, literally, we got 33 of them already implemented. So technology is an easy one. I think the pandemic jump-started that, because a lot of people were looking around at their desktop wondering how they were supposed to work from home. And certain offices already had great technology to work from home, but other offices had to really catch up quick. So number of different areas, really looking forward to this Congress. And I appreciate you all taking the time to do this, and thank you.
With the extension of the committee this Congress, and you both have talked about how well the committee worked over the last 2 years and how successful it was, and really for the first time in this sort of effort coming up with this magnitude of recommendations. But As we know with Congress, change happens and people come and go. And in a committee of 12, you have 7 new members. And I know you recently held a retreat, which the committee itself has recommended as something that other committees should try to do to build up better relationships within the committee. Can you talk a little bit about that retreat and what were the major takeaways and how is the committee coming together?
Yeah, I will tell you part of our recommendations, and we're trying to actually walk the walk when we make these recommendations, is for each committee to do a joint planning retreat, not just with their own party, but with Democrats and Republicans. I've never been part of an organization until Congress that didn't have a unified mission of what do you want to get done. And so part of the role of our committee was to sit down with all 12 of our members and say, what do we want to get done? Some of that is also just getting to know each other. So for example, we started with, why did you come to Congress? And how has the institution met or failed to meet your expectations? Which starts to demystify some of the issues that we're working on when you have that sense of, well, here's why I came and here's how it's kind of come up short. It really starts to elevate issues that we as a committee could work on. And so, you started to gravitate towards some themes. There's a lot of members who are interested in, and germane to the BPC, interested in figuring out how do we change some of the norms and culture within Congress to foster more collaboration so that it's not just sort of persistently the Hatfields and McCoys on opposite sides of the gymnasium, throwing rocks at each other. I think there's a keen interest by members of our committee in looking at issues related to civic engagement. How do we engage our constituents? I think a shortcoming of our work in the last Congress, and it's something that we're going to elevate and continue to work on, is issues related to continuity of Congress. Now, our committee did make a number of recommendations focused on how do we get through a pandemic, but we did not look at the type of sort of large scale attack or crisis that could really cripple the ability of Congress to function. And I think as we've talked with external stakeholders in particular, there's a recognition that more work needs to be done there. And so these issues all sort of came up in our discussion as a committee during our bipartisan retreat. I will mention, we also did something a little bit different. We brought in an outside facilitator just to talk about January 6th and some of the dynamic coming out of January 6th, how that shapes the work of our committee and how it may make more challenging the work of our committee. I actually think that was an important conversation. You've seen in a number of committees where issues related to January 6th have started to become that argument you got in with your partner that gets brought up when you can't agree on what to have for dinner. And I'm anxious about that. I'm concerned about that. And I think part of the way you move forward, I'm not sure we can necessarily move past it per se, but we do need to move forward as an institution. And part of that is just understanding where people are coming from and having some dialogue about it. And we did that at our bipartisan planning retreat as well.
I know so much of that, as you mentioned, the ability to have a dialogue and be able to hear the other side and have that free exchange is so important to moving beyond and to figuring out how can you move forward in a more constructive fashion. One of the questions that have with what the committee has recommended in the past is sort of a BPC has embraced as well, which is the idea of how do you get people just to kind of appreciate where each other are coming from and the ability to visit each other's districts. And we run the American Congressional Exchange Program. I know, Congressman Kilmer, you've had the opportunity to participate in that activity, and the committee has embraced encouraging people to do that more often. And Congressman Timmons, we welcome you to join us on one of our ACE trips. But do you see that ability of the committee to expand on that and whether it be field hearings or other types of engagement where you can really get people to visit each other's hometowns and get a better appreciation for where they're coming from and the voices and the perspectives that they're bringing into Congress? Maybe Congressman Timmons, do you have thoughts?
No, absolutely. First, I'd love to participate. Sounds fantastic. My biggest thing is, how do you work with people in a constructive manner if you don't know them? And we're I call it pinballing around Washington, because you're going from committee hearings to floor votes to, conference meetings and then fundraising dinners. You're literally just running around, and you're never actually developing relationships, trying to understand where other people are coming from. So anything that we can do to facilitate more time together with all of our colleagues is something that I fully support. And I really think that the calendar and the schedule is part of that, because when you're traveling as much as you're actually working, it's just not an efficient use of time. So if we can create any opportunities for members to develop relationships, that's the solution. That's the path forward, because a lot of the noise that we hear from people yelling at each other on Twitter, that doesn't happen if you're friends with them. And if you think back to the 90s, when then Speaker Gingrich moved everybody back to their district, said you needed to, if you live in Washington, you're part of the swamp, and it's not, you're not going to get reelected. Back then, they had relationships. They went out to dinner together. The kids played sports together. Their wives were friends. Their husbands were friends. So I mean, we got to find a way, and we're going to be very intentional about it this Congress, of giving members opportunities to build relationships, whether that's on congressional delegation trips, whether it's district exchange trips, whether it's just giving them more time in Washington to actually get to know each other. That's one thing that that is how we change this institution. And the American people deserve it, and our country needs it.
Congressman Timmons, you've talked about, people needing and deserving a better functioning Congress, and Congressman Kilmer, you talked about sort of at the retreat a discussion and theme around kind of engaging constituents. And with everything going on in the lives of the American public, from getting back to work, rebuilding businesses, to getting their kids back to school, how can we get the American public to care about these issues, especially when it may mean spending more on the legislative branch? And so in essence, why should a modern Congress matter to your constituents?
As we look at the work of our committee, it's really in the service of how do you have a Congress that works better for the American people? I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm part of an organization that, according to recent polling, is less popular than head lice, colonoscopies, and the rock band Nickelback. And unfortunately, too often it's earning those low approval ratings. You see that anytime there's a breakdown in the legislative process. You see that every time there's a government shutdown. And you see that in the inability to solve some big problems facing the American people. And so I think to some degree, the American people just want it to work. They want it to work for them. They want significant problems facing our country to get solved. The other thing I will mention, and you asked why the American people should care about sort of increasing congressional capacity. Nature abhors a vacuum. And my observation is, in the absence of Congress having the capacity to solve some of these problems themselves, you see other things fill that void. Sometimes that's the executive branch, but sometimes that's paid lobbyists who play an outsized role in the policy formation process, or in the process of seeing what gets passed and what doesn't get passed. And I would argue that does not serve the interests of the American people. And so much of what we have recommended as a committee was really in the service of, how do you just make this work better? How do you solve problems? And how do you have Congress have the capacity to actually engage, so that it's not sort of theater, but rather the process as intended by our founders of navigating tough issues on behalf of the American people?
I want to just remind our audience, if they're wanting to submit questions, to use our live chat on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter using hashtag BPC Live. Congressman, building on this kind of capacity question, and we were before the event talking with Congressman Timmons about how you were finishing your master's and a focus on cybersecurity, and obviously cybersecurity has been in the headlines over the weekend with the attack on a major pipeline in the United States. And being a member of Congress in the 21st century certainly requires having to deal with highly complex issues, and whether it be from understanding vaccines to cybersecurity. And Can you elaborate a little bit more on this thing? How well prepared is the legislative branch when it comes to particularly science and technology? And does it need its own capacity to deal with those challenges? And how is the committee looking at that? And I know you had some recommendations last Congress on that, but do you see further work moving forward to touch on those issues?
Sure, I'll jump on this one. So I look back to 2008, 2010, when we had, less than $10 trillion in debt. And now here we are, and we have 30 trillion in debt. So when I'm answering the last question first, when you have this conversation around, we don't need to give Congress more money, we don't need to increase their budget, we don't need to do this or that. I'm just looking around like, if we hit $50 trillion in debt and we either have inflation or we lose our status as the global reserve currency, our country's gone. And I don't know what that looks like, but it's going to be really bad. So investing more money in the legislative process to have better policies coming out of the legislative branch and making these hard decisions, which at the end of the day, both parties are just kicking the can and they're just saying, we're just going to spend more. We're not going to have real conversations. And that's been going on for a decade now. And we've got to find a path forward for our spending. And if that means giving more money to the legislative branch, I'll be the first person to stand up and say, we got to do that. So now to your next question, cybersecurity is extremely challenging to understand. You got 535 between the House and the Senate. I feel pretty good that, less than 10% really has a strong understanding of it. We're behind. We're very far behind. Congress needs to create a federal solution to increase our cybersecurity posture. California's already done it with the CCPA, and then Washington's about to do a privacy law. And as all of these states take this challenge on with data privacy and data security, it's going to be incredibly inefficient in the U.S. economy, and it's going to make us less competitive in the global economy. So we need to invest in making sure we have the best people possible giving members advice. And I'm not telling all the other members that they need to go get a master's in cybersecurity. I did it because I'm a little bit crazy. But at the end of the day, what happened on Friday with the Colonial Pipeline? If that happened in the winter in the Northeast when there's a big freeze, and if that happened to the electrical grid or to the gas grid during a weather event, I mean, tens of thousands of people are going to die. And it seems that the malicious actors that did the hack on Friday, I mean, they even did things that they could have done worse. Let's just put it that way. They could have done a lot worse. So, I really think that we got to invest in these resources. Speaking of investing, I got to plug my computer in because it's about to die. So hold on one second, but I'll turn it over to the chairman.
Kilmer, maybe you can pick up on one of the issues when we talk about the need for expanded capacity, and some of that comes with highly trained staff and a professional staff that maybe require a higher range of salaries to recruit and retain them. Do you see the ability of Congress to tackle the issue of pay for staff, or is that too much of a political liability? And that comes to us from Zach on Twitter.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot of reasons that staff leaves. Pay is certainly one of them. We've seen pay not keep pace with that of the executive branch, certainly not keep pace with that of the private sector. So part of the discussion we have had as a committee and part of the recommendations we've made is trying to, one, establish non-binding pay bands. So depending upon your position, you have at least a sense of what the range is and what the upward mobility is within a congressional office. Two, we're trying to pull, each office gets what's called the MRA, which is sort of the allocation to the office of their budget. We're trying to pull some things out of the MRA, things like the basic technology investments, potentially things like, when you do telephone town halls, could we get one kind of big contract for Congress rather than having each member office pay for that out of their MRA, with the notion that that could free up some capacity to pay staff better. We also, though, acknowledge that pay is not the only part of this. benefits is part of it as well. It is, in my view, completely bonkers that the district staff that I have here in the state of Washington are currently required to be on the DC Health Exchange. So one of our recommendations was, hey, knock that off. That doesn't really make any sense. They're the only workers in the state of Washington who are required to be on the Washington DC Health Exchange. So either letting letting staff be on their own state's exchange or be part of the FEHB like every other federal employee, given that option, I think makes some sense. The other thing we have heard is a desire for when people come into a congressional office or to work for a committee, that they have opportunities for professional development. And the CAO has established a staff academy, but actually sort of putting that on steroids and making sure that staff is able to develop skills that could make them more saleable, either in another job within the Congress or going to work for a committee, or God forbid, at some point they move on from Congress, that they're developing those capabilities. And then finally, I think there's recognition that when someone comes to work in Congress, they want to see things get done too. They want to see more pucks get into the net. And in recent years, some of the dysfunction has inhibited that. And so part of recruiting, retaining, and having more diverse staff is making sure that we're getting more wins so that they feel a sense of efficacy and they're more inclined to stick around. This is an issue that our committee is going to continue to engage on. And in terms of whether that's a tough sell to the American people, what I would tell you is I think there is a sense by the American people currently that Congress is punching below its weight, that it's failing to step up and solve some of the big problems. And, as William mentioned, if you look at those problems as debt, that's, the issues are getting worse, not better. If you look at issues related to immigration or, pick your topic, there's been a failure of Congress too often to step up and actually solve those problems. And I think if the American people are not prepared to give Congress something for nothing, but I think and our committee has really sought to draw a straight line between a persistent erosion of congressional capacity, a consistent increase in turnover within Congress, and a rising inability of Congress to solve big problems. And I think if we can demonstrate that if we start to rebuild that capacity, if we stop the persistent self-lobotomy that Congress has given itself for the last 3 decades, and actually invest in building capacity, maybe you start to see some stuff get done.
Building on this pucks in the net, Lee Adrian on YouTube has this question: has the select committee addressed a return to regular order of significant legislation coming out of committee fact gathering and collaborative work rather than bills being dictated by leadership?
It's something we talk about often. And, again, the committee process is so challenging at times, largely because the committees are so overpopulated. I mean, the Financial Services Committee was just reduced in size and we still have 50 plus 60 members. I mean, so trying to build consensus is very challenging in the current environment. And so everything that we're talking about, you got to have relationships in order to create the policy that has bipartisan support, to then have the hearings. My entire time in Congress, it's gone the opposite way. It starts at the top, and then we receive notice that we're going to vote on something in 24 hours, and it's 1,200 pages long. I think the American Rescue Plan was 5,400 pages long. But I mean, I'm not maligning the other party. I think that we would be doing the same thing if the tables returned. So I just think the question is, how do we create a culture that facilitates these conversations? Because I'm not even really clear. Something like immigration should not be as difficult as it is to fix. There's a number of different levers, and you're going to not get all you want, but you're going to be better when you finish it. And they're not even happening. I don't know of groups of Republicans and Democrats that are sitting down talking about how we're going to fix immigration. I know that the Republicans have tried to fix it and failed, and the Democrats have tried to fix it and failed. So here we are. How long will we not fix these major problems before we actually wake up and say, we got to try this a different way? I'm hopeful that we can be a part of that process reform.
Michelle, can I take a swing at that too?
Sure.
So I think some of this gets at some of the capacity issues we've been discussing, right? The committees actually having the staff capacity to solve big problems, and being able to work through things together. The other part's tricky. And, I'm happy to crowdsource to everyone who's watching this if they have suggestions. Some of this gets at norms and culture, and that's something that our committee has talked about and has engaged on and will continue to engage on in this Congress. But let me give you an example. I came out of a state legislature in which every bill was taken up under an open rule, where if you had an amendment that it was at all germane to the subject of the bill, you could offer it, it would be debated, and it would be voted on. And I can count in 8 years in the Washington State Legislature, maybe 5 or 6 times where that was abused, where someone did a gotcha amendment solely to try to make hay in a political context, to use it in an attack ad. Now you contrast that with Congress, where more often than not, the legislative process is used for political troublemaking. And that is, I think, led to, no matter who is in the majority, a process that is more closed rather than open. So as we talk about kind of going back to regular order, you have a process that is too often closed because of the likelihood that it will be used to score political points. That ends up being negatively reinforcing, because my observation is when you sideline elected officials, it's not dissimilar to my new puppy. The Kilmers have a new puppy, and when you don't keep her engaged constructively, she chews the furniture. And unfortunately, there's a fair amount of furniture chewing that's happening in our nation's capital. And so trying to, but that's not an issue of rules or procedures. That's an issue of culture and norms. And I know that's something that the BPC is very invested in. It's something that our committee, I think, is going to, and we've been talking to political scientists and organizational psychologists. I talked to a sports coach last week about how do you change culture. We've talked to business consultants. At this point, I'm prepared to talk to an exorcist. Anything we can do to try to figure out how do you have a culture in which, problem solving becomes sort of the point of the day, not political games.
Norms and culture obviously cross the Capitol boundary to the other side, and the House has done a lot of self-reflection here through the committee and your leadership. What kind of conversations are you having with your colleagues in the Senate, and do you see the ability for the Senate to the extent that you can opine on the other chamber, see the Senate embracing a similar exercise, and if the committee can help that process forward?
I'll take a quick swing, and then I'm sure William may want to chime in as well. We've had some conversations, as our committee's been underway. I've had some outreach from members of the Senate saying, tell me about what you're doing and how this is working and those sorts of things, with an eye towards potentially replicating the work of our committee on the House side, or potentially at some point doing a joint committee, recognizing that the issues that bedevil Congress are not unique to one side of the rotunda. We've also heard some outreach. We've also received some outreach from former senators who have said, hey, the Senate should be doing this too. I also just want to add, Michelle, that our committee's been really different. It's different than any other committee I've been part of in Congress, not just, as you mentioned, in terms of, the bipartisan retreat. We have a bipartisan staff. We made a decision not to, every other committee in Congress, you get the funding for your committee and you divide it in half, and Democrats get their half and Republicans get their half. Democrats usually use their half to hire people who put on blue jerseys, and Republicans hire people who put on red jerseys. We're not doing that. We have a joint staff. Some of people have a Republican background, some a Democratic background. And everybody's putting on a jersey that says, let's fix Congress. And I think that has held some allure, not just to our colleagues in the House, but to senators as well, who've said, gosh, it'd sure be nice if we could get back to just trying to get stuff done.
And I think that the Senate has some institutional advantages that allow them to be a little bit less dysfunctional. There's fewer people, for one. Just trying to get to know 435 members of Congress is just an insurmountable task. So inevitably, as a freshman, you spend most of your time with the people that you see in conference and that are in your political party. And so you have to take very intense and intentional steps to build relationships across the aisle. Senate, obviously, 6-year term versus a 2-year term. They're not really campaigning for the first 2 or 3 years. I mean, and so they have more time to try to build relationships. And then the filibuster, obviously. I mean, that creates some bipartisanship because inevitably there's going to have to be some moderation of whatever policy is attempting to be put through. So I do think that they have some advantages, but it still comes back to the fact that the House of Representatives, my campaign slogan in 2018 was "Washington is broken," and I always joke that I got up to Congress and I never really appreciated how true my campaign slogan was. I guess that's why they sent me here, but now they want me to fix it, and unfortunately, I'm in a position where I can actually be held accountable if we don't fix it, because we're on the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress, which is awesome. It's why I ran. But at the same time, we have a very important task ahead. So if we don't succeed, people are going to be understandably upset with me. So.
Well, last question, and I pose it to both of you, and it's a 2-part question. And you've hit on the great work of the committee from last Congress. And when you look back on the recommendations from last Congress, or you put yourself into the future, looking back on this 117th Congress, what's the one reform that each of you hope to say, that's the reform that's going to make the most difference, or it's going to make a very significant difference? And what do you need from us to help achieve that victory? What do you need from the reform community, the public at large, academia, the broad breadth of people who are very interested in wanting to see Congress function better? Congressman Timmons?
I'll lead off. So, it all comes back to this culture issue. And I focus on the calendar and the schedule because I think that is a critical component of getting people to change their behaviors. Because if you're together more, if you have more time, if you're in the airport less and you're in Washington working more, building relationships, and you're being more efficient with your time. And I just think there's a lot of angst that exists because we're just all over the place in our day-to-day schedule when we're here. So if we can find a way to be in Washington more, working more, traveling less, and that there's a lot of different components to that, but at the end of the day, every 5 or 10 minutes we can save of 435 members of the House with their teams, is a huge win. So, if you can give these people an extra 10, 20, 30 days in next year in the 118th Congress, whatever that may be, using that time to then try to reform the body and reform our behavior, I think is a critical component. But again, everything that I think that we're focusing on is how to get people to work together better. And I think calendar and schedule is a big component of that. But Mr. Chairman, what do you think?
Michelle, I'm going to cheat and I'm going to mention 3 things. One, we made a number of recommendations related to budget and appropriations reforms, some of which have been enacted already, including the return of the ability of members of Congress to direct spending to priorities in their own districts, which is not insignificant. It's not the only budget and appropriations reform proposal that we made, and I think that's going to be one area where the reform community can be helpful in helping us see some of these other reforms get passed into law. I say that in part because when the American public thinks of the dysfunction in Congress, it's one of the areas where they feel it the most. When Congress kicks the can on spending deals, when there are, at the worst, budget, government shutdowns, it's an acute problem. And the reforms in that space, I think, could make a big difference. Two, William mentioned some of the proposals regarding freshman orientation. We made a number of reforms related to how members of Congress get onboarded. I mentioned I spoke to a sports coach a couple of weeks back, and he said the best way to change culture is with the incoming members of your team. That you basically set you try to get buy-in on the front end. And so when you have a system where new members are learning, like there's now a requirement that they do a session on civility and collaboration in freshman orientation. That's different. And not having members segregated by party from the very beginning, I think, is a positive reform that could make a difference over the long haul. And then three, I actually think there's a number of reforms we haven't come up with yet, specifically related to how you change the culture of this place. And it's something, again, that so many in the reform community, and particularly the Bipartisan Policy Center, have been so terrific at trying to figure out how do you foster civility and collaboration in a town where that's often not the norm. We have made some recommendations in that space. Our intent is to do more in that arena. And I would invite everyone who's watching or listening to consider yourselves deputized to help us work through some of those issues. And we need your ideas, so keep them coming.
Thank you, Congressman. I know many of us will carry out that charge and stand ready to work with the committee and help you achieve further success. I want to wrap up and thank Representatives Kilmer and Timmons for joining us today, and for our audience for tuning in. And with all the challenges facing our country as we come out of the pandemic, and with so many Americans still struggling, it might be easy for us to dismiss the concept of modernizing Congress as a lesser priority, but perhaps it is, as you've noted, one of the most important things that we can spend time and effort focused on. And we commend you for your public service and your dedicated leadership on the Select Committee. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.